This book was given to me by a listener of the podcast about 2 years ago now when I was on tour in Baltimore. So before I begin the episode, I just want to say thank you. It really is amazing to contemplate the way in which the podcast has touched many lives, and obviously you guys reciprocate, and I'm really grateful for all of you. So without further ado, we will begin this two-parter, the end of Season 5, with some lines from Holderlin. Quote, "Now he will strive to honor the dwellers in heaven. Everything living must utter their praise in word and in deed. Where are they, the famous, those crowns of the banquet? Why does a god no more inscribe the brow of a mortal, setting his seal as of old on the victim chosen above? Or he would come himself, assuming the shape of a mortal, thus with solace and peace to crown the celestial feast. But we, my friend, are too late. The gods, it is true, are living, yet far above ourselves, away in a different world. There they are endlessly active, and seem but little regardful, whether we live or no. Such is their tender concern, knowing that fragile vessels, like us, cannot always contain them. Only at times can man endure the abundance of gods. Life thereafter is but to dream of them. Yet our wanderings help, like sleep, and anguish and night give strength. Meanwhile, it seems to me often better to slumber than live without companions like this. So to linger and know not what to begin or to utter, or in such spiritless times, why be a poet at all?" End quote. Indeed, why be a poet at all? It's a question for our times. It's not often that we stop to take account of the state of poetry in the modern world, but, people pose all sorts of questions these days about the disciplines of philosophy or of science or of the arts in general. The relative unimportance of poetry, though, and the foolishness of anyone who sought to make a career as a poet, that seems so obvious as to seem hardly even worth saying. And yet if we take a broader historical view, an anthropological view even, we'd have to conclude that we're living in a very strange time indeed, because for most of human civilization, poetry has been one of the main forms of communication. And not just communication, mind you, because, that can be accomplished well enough by prose or by technical writing. Poetry doesn't convey information so much as emotion, or even meaning. If we go back to the earliest days of poetic expression, for example, in ancient Greece, we find that poetry communicated myths and stories, values and maxims, the seasons of the life of Theogenes, just as much as the epic verses of Homer that seemed to tell, or purported to tell, of the ancient past of the Greeks. And these poems were meant to be sung. They were meant to be intoned. One's experience of a poem in the ancient world was not reading it on a sheet of paper, it was seeing it performed. In the poem, there was not just truth, but beauty. And in the Bible, in the Old Testament, we have verses and songs across the canon of great world literature, especially the further back in history you go. The greatest jewels of literature are written in verse. Here we're talking about Virgil and Lucretius and Dante and Milton and Shakespeare and Goethe. Poetry was the language for conveying great stories and eternal truths, even religious doctrine. And in the language of poetry, the simple communication of information can't be separated from the symbolic or the archetypal. The symbol and the real are joined, so to speak. And the form and the content are joined. The meter and the flow of the language is just as important as the content. So art and philosophy are joined, because the poem is supposed to instruct you. And so I would argue that it's very, very hard for modern people to grasp that poetry used to be one of the most important things in the whole world. So what happened? Even by the time of Holderlin, not to speak of our own spiritless times. He writes that the gods now live somewhere far away. The hour is late, and the poet now lives without companions. And he asks, why be a poet at all? And it's a question, again, for our times, because Hardly anyone attributes that kind of value to poetry that we used to. And so it raises that perplexing question that poetry had a certain value in the past, it has a completely different value now. What are those values and what changed? Erich Heler begins his book, The Disinherited Mind, with those verses from Holderlin, and he dares to raise Holderlin's question anew, in spite of the modern obtuseness that might prompt us to dismiss the question. He takes seriously what he calls the hazard of modern poetry. Now, he doesn't proceed by, outlining exactly what this hazard is. He kind of saves that for the end. His book instead consists of a series of excursions into the works and lives of several late modern German poets and thinkers, beginning with Goethe, and then he also considers Nietzsche, Rilke, Kafka, Spengler, and Krauss, and he takes us through a rather varied series of insights and observations into their ideas and their struggles, so to speak. For the purposes of this show, I thought we'd do an episode on the first couple of chapters, which are on Goethe, who we've talked about a great deal, and in the final episode of this season, next week, we'll cover 2 of the chapters on Nietzsche, who, we've also talked about a great deal on the show. And so as far as the reading experience, Heller's book, it comes warmly recommended from me. He takes us wandering through the thoughts of these poets and philosophers circling around the central issues of the text, insofar as they have all of these issues that they're sort of working out, philosophical or sort of like values issues. And he doesn't really make the central thesis clear or explicit until the end of the text. So before we get into some of those chapters on Goethe and Nietzsche, I do want to sort of skip to the end and explore Heller's perspective on poetry and the overall thesis of the book, because I think for the type of exegesis that we do here on this podcast, it will be more helpful to know where he's coming from and what the central thesis is before we get into the specifics. And Heller presents this with an anecdote of a peculiar event in the history of Christianity and of Western culture in general. This event is part of an ongoing debate between 2 people, 2 religious leaders who were both Protestants, who rebelled against the papal sovereignty of the Catholic Church. One of them is Erich Zwingli, the leader of the Reformation in Switzerland. The other is Martin Luther, the leader of the Reformation in Germany. Both men founded their own sect of Protestantism, but in the beginning, Luther and Zwingli supported one another and admired one another. Luther began the German Reformation with the 95 Theses, a couple of years before Zwingli attempted to reform the Swiss Church. Zwingli was inspired by Luther, and both men agreed on the central point of sola scriptura, that a Christian needed only the Scripture in order to be a Christian. There's no necessity for a church hierarchy, church tradition, or the interpretations of theologians. You can just follow the Scripture. But soon, the two would come into conflict. In the 1520s, they began to diverge on the subject of the Eucharist, the Holy Communion. After years of disagreement, they met at the Marburg Colloquy in 1529, a conference at the Castle of Marburg in which the 2 men hoped to settle their dispute. There was even a hope that if these 2 leaders could settle this issue, a unified Protestant church could emerge, that there would be only one movement of Protestants which could therefore present a unified front against the Catholics and the Counter-Reformation. Obviously, this was not to be. So what was the debate about? Well, both men rejected the Catholic doctrine of the mystical transubstantiation that was supposed to take place during the Eucharist. The 2 actually agreed on a whole lot, by the way. They came to an agreement on 14 out of the 15 theological points that they wished to settle at Marburg. But the one issue where they could not come to an agreement was on whether the communion was literally the body and blood of Christ, or whether the bread and wine merely signified or symbolized the body and the blood. Heler writes, quote, "The dispute is about the nature of the Eucharist, the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. The bread and wine, are they the body and blood of Christ, or are they mere symbols? Luther, with all his deviations from the traditional dogma, is the man of the Middle Ages. The word and the sign are for him not merely pictures of the thought, but the thing itself. Yet for Zwingli, steeped in the enlightened thought of the Italian Renaissance, this is a barbarous absurdity. The sacrament is merely a symbol. That is, it symbolically represents what it itself is not. This is indeed a very particular occasion. It is a unique and uniquely sacred symbol that is being discussed. The issue is clearly defined and specified. It is not even new. There are precedents for it throughout the history of Christian theology. All this should warn us against facile generalization. Yet there remains the fact that never before had this question raised so much dust and generated so much heat, for now it is merely the theological climax of a deep revolution in the thought and feelings with which both men respond to the world they inhabit. The Miltonian opportunity for a truth who, when she gets a free and willing hand, opens herself faster than the pace of method and discourse can overtake her. It is now that 30 years of war lie ahead, and the slow emergence of an age in which not only the sacraments but the holiness of all that is holy will cease to be literally true. There will be a world which must find it more and more difficult even to grasp, let alone accept, what was in Luther's mind when he fought Zwingli's demythologizing. Lost will be that unity of word and deed, of picture and thing, of the bread and the glorified body. Body will become merely body, and symbol merely symbol. What then is the nature of the revolution signaled by a theological dispute that seems concerned merely with degrees of symbolic literalness? And what, above all, has it to do with our subject, which is the fortunes of modern poetry? Perhaps we can answer both questions at once by saying that Zwingli's argument did to the status of religion, poetry, and art what some time later Copernicus did to the status of the earth. At the end of a period that we rather vaguely call the Middle Ages, there occurred a radical change in man's idea of reality, in that complex fabric of unconsciously held convictions about what is real and what is not. This was a revolution comparable to that earlier one which Nietzsche called the victory of the Socratic mind over the spirit of Dionysian tragedy. End quote. So obviously, from what we know today, Lutheranism succeeded far better in terms of name recognition than Zwinglianism did. There are plenty of Lutheran churches here in America. Here you pretty much never see like a Zwinglian church. I don't recall if I've ever seen one. But that can be a bit misleading because Zwingli's theology is arguably broadly integrated into most Reformed churches around today. Even the Lutherans acknowledge him as an influence, to some extent. So Luther managed to secure a sect with his name on it, but the theology of Zwingli survives. And just speaking anecdotally here, his conception of the Eucharist is probably more common among mainline Protestants, in my experience, than Luther's view. And it would certainly characterize the secular view of the Eucharist, right? Like, regardless of whatever the Christians are saying is happening with the bread and the wine, the secular person would say it's obviously just a ritual, it's just a symbol, it's not the real thing. But importantly, Heler isn't arguing that this dispute between Luther and Zwingli caused this shift or this revolution in consciousness. He's saying it's indicative of it, or we might say it signifies the event. We could say it symbolizes the event. And that's part of the brilliance of Heller's work, by the way. An undercurrent of it, I guess, is that he's often sort of presenting his arguments symbolically. He's getting us to think symbolically, if not in the old way, in the medieval way, in a way that at the very least treats the symbol as showing us something real beyond just the individual material facts or whatever it might be, that there's something in the symbol that is real. And so that's part of the brilliance here, is that it's a central theme in the work, but it also comes out in the method. And so the Marburg colloquy, that happens on a concrete historical date. We can cite that as indicating that the medieval way of viewing the world has begun to wane and will eventually disappear. And that's a real event. It's not causal, but it is symbolic. Through the image of that disputation, we see the real. And not merely as an image, depicting what the event itself is not. Rather, the event itself is that revolution in thought in the form of an image. If we consider the period in which Luther and Zwingli live and what came before them and what went after them, their lives occur at the beginning of the modern age. Carlyle famously said that the three aspects of the modern world are the printing press, gunpowder, and the Protestant religion, while Luther and Zwingli helped to summon one of those three essential pillars of modernity. And what follows that shakeup, the shifting of theological fault lines in which the sovereign authority of the church to interpret Scripture is challenged, what follows this is the age of reason, the Enlightenment, Bacon and Descartes, rationalism, empiricism, humanism, eventually secularism, and eventually we arrive at the current year in which almost no one thinks about the world, quote-unquote, symbolically anymore. In other words, no one thinks according to the notion that the symbol is real and that the real is symbolic. Or at least it's a very rare way of viewing the world these days. And that revolution in thought overcomes the medieval view of the world. We might call that old view a mystical way of viewing the world, or a way of viewing the world in which there are no merely mundane events. Rather, the transmundane, the otherworldly, is always at play in the physical world. So when the soldier shouts, "God is with us," he means that literally. He does mean it symbolically, but it has a real sense to it. When the peasant says, "The devil's tempting me," he also means that. It's really true. It's true to him. And when the priest said, "This wafer is the body of Christ," he also meant that literally, or at least there's a sense to it that is literal. Arguably, this kind of worldview is what Carl Jung, among others, also realized that we'd lost, and he attempted to recapture this perspective as a way of reopening an old path to spirituality, which he felt was a key to individuation. I think what Heler is pointing to here accounts for a lot of the focus on symbol in Jung's work. And Jung attempted to reinvigorate our reverence for the symbol. And ironically, he has to do this. He has to proceed by making an argument in terms of scientific plausibility for the symbol as real, right? His archetypes, these eternal images or personalities, they really exist in the unconscious. Here is all my scientific evidence that they exist. But as Heller points out, even when we go back to the writings of Pascal, a Christian, this issue is central even to him. The dawning of a totalizing rationality that discounts what Pascal would have called the reasons of the heart, and only allowed for the objective analysis of what actually is. And that's in the 1600s, right? And so what Heller is pointing to is an aspect of the Enlightenment zeitgeist that's not discussed quite as much, or at least rarely put into these exact terms regarding poetry. Normally, when we talk about this revolution in thought, again, we talk about those figures like Copernicus or like Darwin or Nietzsche or Freud. Those people who unveiled some superstition or absurdity seemingly in the name of reason, in the name of advancing human knowledge, advancing human enlightenment, but who left us feeling smaller and shabbier than we were before. The Earth becomes a planet among planets, the human being becomes a species among species, morality is a delusion, the sacred is a pathology, but rarely is it brought up that one of the casualties is poetry. Really, we could say that this is a disruption to art itself that happens in the Enlightenment, to all art. But it comes through with particular force in the example of poetry because, again, poetry was once thought to convey truth. The words of the great poems, the epics, the psalms, the words of Virgil and Dante, these were thought to be true. Again, not in a scientific sense. Even to invoke that term in a scientific sense, what we're invoking is a concept of truth divorced from beauty, or the real divorced from the symbol, knowledge divided off from art. That's what truth in a scientific sense really means. Heller writes, quote, "One of the ways of speaking about the revolution I have in mind is to say that it reduced the stature of the symbol to the merely symbolic. Thus it deprived the language of religion, as well as of art, of an essential degree of reality. At the beginning, the separation proved most beneficial to both partners. Reality, freed from its commitments to the symbol, became more really real than before. The hand of man, Reaching out for his reality was no longer unsteadied by the awe and fear of the symbolic mystery. The artist ceased to be a humble craftsman supplying goods for the common trade between heaven and earth. He set himself up as a dealer in very special specialities, with a heaven all to himself and an earth to look down upon. But there were also signs of uneasiness. They mounted to a climax in the 17th century. What was first felt to be a liberation appeared more and more as a robbery, robbed of its real significance. What did the symbol signify? Robbed of its symbolic meaning, what did reality mean? What was the state on earth? A leviathan. What was God? More and more a deus absconditus, an infinitely remote and impenetrably veiled God. End quote. So this revolution in thought has very broad implications, and Heler is certainly not the only one to make these observations about this period, but I think he puts it into new and interesting language. It's the divorce between the symbol and reality, which allows art to become more artistic, more creative, more spontaneous, and the study of reality to get us closer to the real, but it also deprives the real of meaning, and it deprives the symbol of significance. And so we've now fundamentally altered our relationship to both truth and beauty through this separation. Poetry no longer contains truth, it's just pretty words. And so anyone in his right mind ought to ask, why be a poet at all? And so Heler talks about the hazard of modern poetry in different language throughout the book. It comes out in each of these excursions, and he even defines it in a couple different ways. At the beginning, he says the hazard is the poet's consciousness of life's continually depreciating value. And at the end of the book, he says the hazard is that the poet can only proceed by faith, but owing to the rationalism of the modern mind that knows that faith is another error, he therefore lives on a razor's edge between faith and despair. And we can certainly catch very clear glimpses of exactly what he means when we consider figures like Pascal, Rilke, Kafka, even Nietzsche. Now that we've established the landscape in which the book wanders, let's talk about Goethe. And just as we began the episode with a peculiar meeting and a peculiar dispute between two famous men in history, the first chapter on Goethe begins with yet another dispute between two different men. One is Johann Wolfgang von Goethe himself, the German poet and playwright. The other is his friend and rival playwright, Friedrich Schiller. And this meeting was also formative to their friendship. Heler writes, quote, "It is in a meeting of a society of natural scientists that the friendship begins, with the man to whom 4 years later Goethe was to express his gratitude for having cured the paralysis of his poetic genius. Goethe writes, quote, "And this happy occasion came about through my work concerning the metamorphoses of plants," end quote. After that meeting, it took place in Jena, and some learned scientist lectured. Goethe and Schiller, leaving the room, happened to reach the door at the same time. Goethe writes, quote, "A conversation ensued. He, Schiller, appeared to have taken an interest in the lecture and remarked very intelligently, perspicaciously, and to me most agreeably, that such a dissecting manner of dealing with nature could not possibly attract the layman. I replied that this manner may be uncanny even to the initiates, and that perhaps there was still the possibility of another method, one which would not tackle nature by merely dissecting and particularizing, but show her at work and alive, manifesting herself in her wholeness in every single part of her being. He said he would like to learn more about this, though he did not conceal his doubts. He would not admit that all this emerged, as I insisted, from experience itself," end quote. In no time at all, it seems, their conversation had reached the crucial point. This is a dramatic climax in the history of German thought and letters. Goethe and Schiller, whose names will forever mark the summit of literary achievement to which the genius of their nation, and probably of Europe, could rise in the second half of the 18th century, wandering through the streets of Jena, really in contact with each other for the first time. That it had not happened before, in spite of some previous chance meetings, was the outcome of strategy on the part of Goethe, who was determined to avoid the man from whom he was separated by, quote, "more than the earth's diameter," and whom he found guilty not only of theatrical excess, but also of philosophical wrong-headedness, end quote. And further down, Heler continues, quote, "They arrive at Schiller's house, and still talking, Goethe enters. This is Goethe's account of the occasion. Quote, I explained to him with great vivacity the metamorphosis of plants, and with a few characteristic strokes of the pen, conjured up before his eyes a symbolical plant. He listened and looked at it with great interest and intelligence. But when I had ended, he shook his head, saying, This has nothing to do with experience. It is an idea. I raised my eyebrows, somewhat annoyed, for he had put his finger on precisely the point which separated us. I replied, Well, so much the better. It means that I have ideas without knowing it, and can even see them with my eyes." End quote. They carried on in their discussion, with great polemical obstinacy on each side. Goethe reports that some of Schiller's sentences made him quite unhappy. For instance, the following: "How can one ever equate experience with ideas? For an idea is characterized precisely by the fact that experience can never fully be congruous to it." And Goethe, in his account of the discussion, reflects that, quote, "If he takes for an idea what to me is experience, then there must, after all, prevail some mediation, some relationship between the two." End quote. And so that's roughly the end of the discussion as Heler records it. And I know that was a lot to read from the primary source, but I think it's very fascinating in light of the issues that Heler has established with this revolution in thought and the separation between the symbol and the real. And as I've mentioned on the show, Goethe studied all sorts of topics outside of poetry and philosophy and literature. This is the phase of his life where he has a really serious interest in the sciences. He had a whole theory of the science of color, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and he had an interest in botany, which metamorphosized eventually into this theory about plants. And strangely enough, his dispute with Schiller and his theory about plants epitomizes this shift that has occurred, this division between the real and the symbol, or between experience and the idea, as it comes up here. And by the way, prior to this meeting, Goethe was writing in his journals that he feared his scientific interests of late were devouring his energy, making it harder for him to write poetry. Goethe is one of the most productive men to have ever lived, and like all productive men, he still feels like he never has enough time. And occasionally, some interest of his pulls away so much attention and energy that it feels like it jeopardizes his other work or his great work. But in any case, Goethe had devoted a lot of thought and effort to this hypothesis on the metamorphosis of plants for years at this point. His theory centers around a concept that Goethe christens the Urpflanze. So the early version, the first version, the prototype, and plant. That's what the word is a portmanteau of. So the prototypical plant. We might even say the Platonic form of the plant. Not of any one particular type of plant, but the form of plants in general. Except, of course, Goethe would reject that it is a Platonic form, or a Platonic idea, in that it is not, strictly speaking at least, an idea. Rather, the Urpflanze, this prototypical form, can somehow be perceived through experience. In other words, that there's an empirical basis, something coming through the senses, for perceiving a universal truth, something like that. That our fallacious sense organs could actually give us a direct perception of an ideal form, which could be rendered into an image. And at the very least, the connection between idea and experience at least suggests, as he says, some mediation, some traffic, some relation between the two phenomena. This is, in the broadest, most charitable terms, Goethe's thesis, which is really, it should be said, a metaphysical thesis and not a botanical thesis. So it's fascinating that this whole conception comes to him through his study of botany, but he's essentially fascinated by the idea of the Urpflanze as a kind of philosophical issue. On April 17th, 1787, while visiting Sicily, Goethe wrote the following in his journal. And mind you, this is 7 years before the meeting with Schiller. That's how long he's been occupied with this concept. Goethe writes, quote, "It is a real disaster for a man to be tempted by a host of conflicting demons. This morning I went to the public gardens, calmly and firmly determined to carry on with my poetic designs. Yet in no time another ghost, which had secretly pursued me all these days, had caught hold of me. The many plants which elsewhere I used to see only in pots, and mostly under glass, grow here cheerfully under the open sky, and, living as they are really meant to live, reveal themselves to us with greater clarity. Confronted with so many new shapes, I was once more overcome by my old whimsical fascination. Might I not discover among the crowd the Urpflanze, that original plant from which all others are derived? After all, it must exist. How could I otherwise know that this shape and that are both plants, if they were not all organized according to one principle?" End quote. And that's the essence of Goethe's approach to botany and to biology in general, and we could even say to science in general. He writes elsewhere, quote, "Nature has neither kernel nor shell. She is everything at once," end quote. So the theory put forward in the Metamorphosis of Plants presents the evolution of floral life as though it is a kind of creative dialectic with the external world. Right? There's one central idea of the plant, the Urpflanze, which metamorphosizes itself according to the pressure of external nature, which it responds to. And there's a unity to the organism, or to the species, or even to the kingdom of plants. There's an archetype of the plant of which all the individuals are modifications. And while there's a great deal of hard science in Goethe's book on plants, which he eventually published in 1790, the really relevant claims for our purposes are these metaphysical claims about nature. In other words, the form, the classification, the category that we make of plant is not merely an arbitrary or subjective distinction between organisms. Rather, there is a reality to that class. And what's fascinating about this whole line of reasoning is the degree to which it's still relevant to some extent in biology today, insofar as we do divide the living world into kingdoms and phylums and classes and orders and so on. But the way that we decide what constitutes one or another species, where we draw the line exactly, well, that requires us to posit one trait or a series of traits that define that species against the others. And as you proceed up toward higher and higher classifications, you get broader and broader sets based on fewer criteria. And ultimately, I just want to point out the question of classification is not a scientific question. You can't do an experiment that tells you how you should name an organism or which ones you should class it with, whether, an organism is better placed in set A or set B, or rather the determinations you make about what constitutes your sets, what those dividing lines are going to be. You can't run an experiment to determine that way of classifying your knowledge, right? However it is, like how the animal respirates or how it reproduces, whatever the definitive trait may be, there's no experiment that tells you which definitive trait should determine your sets. From an objective standpoint anyway, from an empirical standpoint, there could always be different classification schema. So Heler writes, quote, "Goethe is one of the first to be fully conscious of the morphological problem in biological studies. It is the unsolved problem and the inspiration of all theories of evolution concerned, as it is with the living form, its genesis and transformation," end quote. And so this issue of schematizing, I want to make it clear that Heler is not trying to suggest in some sort of postmodern fashion that it's a hard problem for science or an unsolvable problem. The argument instead is that we have solved this problem, and the way that we do solve it is by thinking like Goethe. That in adopting the morphology, the typology of species that we have, Goethe's ideas have proven to be fruitful because a biologist today does believe that all plants are unified in all being plants. They all belong to the set called plant, and given the common ancestry of everything in that kingdom, yes, logically speaking, there would have to be one plant, the common ancestor of all plants. Now, Goethe's leap is in treating this as an idea that one can perceive even in living plants today, like directly perceive. That is to say, not just in their ancestry, but something that can be seen through experience, an ideal form that they are all metamorphoses of. The other thing is that Goethe's conclusion in the book is that all is leaf. The whole plant is a metamorphosis of the part of the plant called the leaf. The leaf defines the plant, so to speak, which is kind of problematic. There's linguistic problems with that. Von Helmholtz, the philosopher of science, would also just later dispute this on a factual level. And furthermore, Goethe would later admit to himself above all, that his entire scientific interest was fueled by an intuitive impression that he had, that he was reasoning from an intuitive conclusion. And frankly, that's unscientific. But nevertheless, Goethe's concern with the scientific truth, that this concern that invades and eats away at his artistic energy, this opens up into a much broader issue. Quote, Goethe's morphology, with its insistence on something within, was incommensurable with the scientific methods of his age, and Goethe knew it. How few, he exclaims, draw their inspiration from what is visible to the mind alone. End quote. And so Goethe is touching the fault line that we explored at the beginning of the episode. He writes that the, quote, inmost nucleus determines the exact form of the organism. Its external modifications, according to the conditions, are nevertheless modifications of one inner essence, if you will. And yet he also accounts for evolutionary stages that organisms can, quote, leave behind their fellow creatures with further modifications. So he sits, as Heler puts it, in a neighborhood between Plato and Darwin. And Heler raises the issue of how Goethe would have felt about Darwin. He thinks he would have been both attracted and repulsed by the theory. He would have agreed with the implications about the unity of all life and the, quote, uniformity prevailing within each type of living creature, end quote. But he would have taken issue with Darwinism because of the zeitgeist it was a part of. We mentioned Darwin earlier as, like one of those who humiliated the pride of mankind. And Heler thinks it would not be lost on Goethe how, even as Darwinism takes account in its theories for much of what he himself argued, Goethe's issue really at bottom is with the method, with the approach, with the mindset of science. Heler writes that Goethe was focused on, quote, a sphere of experience which defies that logical analysis proper to the sphere of modern science, and whose language is fundamentally untranslatable into the logically respectable medium of polite abstractions, end quote. So it's the translation of what has been directly perceived, a form, an idea that is directly perceived, into quantities and variables and other mathematical abstractions. The dissolution of that direct experience into a worldview that's mediated by statistics and formulae. And in modern science, that's really the only game in town. It has to be mathematized, and that's why Goethe's work, which is overly philosophical in its focus, is not heralded as one of the great texts of evolutionary biology. Heler writes that Goethe's opposition to Darwin, then, would not be that he would threaten the old religious myths and the morality and piety of Europe, but that, quote, he was terrified that experimental science, in alliance with a mechanistic philosophy of nature, so successful in posing and answering questions about the how of things, might finally abolish in the world all creative interest in what this, that, or the other are and mean. Darwin had to give still greater force to that system of unsystematized, inarticulate fallacies, which one might term the creed of ontological invalidity, in the sense that it dismisses a priori as invalid all ontological assertions, i.e. assertions about the nature and meaning of being, end quote. So let's recall Heidegger and his thesis that the guiding question of philosophy, true philosophy, is the inquiry after the nature of being. What is being? That is the central question. Goethe, in a way, is touching on a similar notion, that this is the lack that he's exposing in modern scientific thought, the inability to address the central question. And why? Well, because we're unable to posit any meaning, really. We're not able to affix meaning to the real. That's the language of poetry, not science. That's part of the separation between knowledge and poetry, between the symbol and the real. We can't say what the empirical facts signify, or at least we can't do that scientifically. We can't run an experiment to say what they mean. And so it would be inaccurate to say that Goethe, just with his poet's heart, he simply wants to bring some of that poetic intuition into the realm of science. No, I think he's raising a real point, a Heideggerian point, about the need for philosophy in the realm of science, as part of science, in order for it to mean anything. And so if there is this lack in science, then we have to raise the serious question of the value of science. Goethe's whole life philosophy, which is very influential on Nietzsche, is that knowledge ought to facilitate our activity. In other words, what you know ought to inform who you are. And there is a certain degree of technical knowledge that might be practical, but have no deeper philosophical significance. It may make you a cultured person to know a fair bit about things that don't directly affect your life as like a bit of trivia or knowledge. But the fact of the matter is, we also need a world picture. None of that is sufficient. No amount of adding together trivial facts constitutes a world picture. And if we inquire here about what a strictly factual account of the human being from evolution would tell us about our place in the world, there's not a whole lot of good arguments against concluding that we're just accidentally conscious apes in an indifferent world. The only purpose you have, if you could even call it that, is simply to reproduce and then die. And that's not the kind of world picture that quickens your activity, as Goethe says. Now, I know some of you could say, but Keegan, it doesn't have to be that story. We're really star stuff. Because, the matter that makes us up was forged in stars billions of years ago. And I would say, okay, exactly, you're making my point. Now you're crafting a myth. You're creating a story. You're focusing in on some favored fact and ignoring others. You're pushing others to the side. And you're creating a narrative that's more edifying for the human being. And I mean, what if we could take that further, can't we? What if we demand that our world picture doesn't just give us an account of our distant past, but the future, the destiny of the human race? We might arrive at a kind of narrative about, say, giving rise to a new form of human life that supersedes this one, Nietzsche's idea of the overman, right? Isn't that something that's biologically demanded if we were to look at just what evolution would seem to demand, that species become stronger, more complex, better, more adaptable, healthier, we would hope. We would hope that the healthy would be what is selected for, as Deleuze would have put it, is what returns. So you see, in order to take these various empirical facts and turn them into knowledge that Goethe would say is worth having, we have to make some sort of claim, not just about how, the trivial facts about how life came about or the mechanisms of how biology works, but again, make a claim about what life is, what its significance is, what its being is. And that's precisely what the purely scientific world, with its allergy to ontology, cannot give us. And so, truth ought to serve life, we might say. And while Nietzsche is often saddled with that kind of interpretation of his view of truth, oftentimes people say that's what Nietzsche thought about the truth, I don't think that's really accurate. I think Goethe fits the bill far better for that type of description, because Nietzsche didn't hold that we needed truths that were invigorating. Nietzsche held that often what invigorates us, what spurs us on to play the game of life, to throw dice in the cosmic game and its seeming indifference, to quicken our activity in the face of despair or meaninglessness or whatever, what we might need is a lie or a myth or a delusion, and that the truth, rather than serving life, might be inimical to life, perhaps in the highest degree. Goethe takes a different tact. He creates a different idea of truth, an opposing idea of truth, which is philosophy and not science, but it's a philosophical truth, a truth that incorporates value or incorporates being into scientific truth, which is on its own incapable of incorporating these things. Heler writes, quote, "For Goethe, all knowledge which cannot be assimilated in a concord of all the human faculties of understanding, heightening and cleansing them in all their mutual interplay, man's senses and reason, his imagination and critical intelligence, as he puts it, all knowledge which will only cause a man to, quote, fret away his days in the narrowest and most joyless limitation, end quote, is fundamentally worthless and undeserving of the name truth. Can man, in this sense, assimilate, realize his descent from the apes? Does he know better, not how he came to be, but what he is?" End quote. And I think that's the best summation of Goethe's contestations, his disputations in the world of botany, the way in which that touches that fault line of what is the significance of man as an organism, as a species. That's eventually what these meditations on, what is the essence of a species, right? Is there an idea? Is there a form? Is there an form of the species? And if so, that would also apply to human beings, right? That there could be a truth about what the human being is that is not limited to a strictly scientific accounting of the facts. Now, Goethe's scientific activity was not limited to botany. He also devised a theory of colors, and funnily enough, this way of thinking about empiricism, Goethe's way of thinking, that colors his thought in that project as well. And what do I mean by that? Well, just as Goethe has this idea of the primordial original plant, the plant, he has this more general idea of the phenomenon, the phenomenon. And the Pflanze would be one such phenomenon, which could be defined as, quote, an idea so fundamental to the quality of a group of phenomena that the human mind is ill-advised to penetrate beyond it, end quote. And that's a really important quotation for understanding what he's talking about with the phenomenon. And this is where Goethe's scientific excursions begin to get a bit out there, because he's essentially saying this form that he can see with his own eyes, or with his mind's eye in a way, and that can be taken in through experience, but with the help of intuition sort of nurtured into being in his mind's eye, that's where the truth is located. And if you penetrate beyond it with mathematical abstractions, you plunge into a potential infinity. And what I mean by that is, it's the frame problem again, right? Where do you draw the frame around the phenomenon? Is the tree separate from the mycelial network, or do you have to include that in your picture of the organism? Is the organism that respirates separate from the entire atmosphere? Is one object, is it a single thing, or is it a collection of particles? To put it straightforwardly, do we have to account for the entire universe in order to account for one phenomenon? Well, the only way around this problem, as Goethe sees it, is to posit the phenomenon. So Goethe would say, whatever your particle physics tells you, that tree is a tree. That's the unity that's perceptible with your mind's eye. It's a kind of metaphysics of plain experience that's revealed by immediate perception. And any attempt to break the object or the phenomenon down further or expand it outward plunges you into that potential infinity, which, because it could expand to encompass the whole universe or down to the smallest atom, and, that will never be resolved except by arbitrary fiat. So instead, we have to acknowledge that the phenomenon as we perceive it has a unity, has a reality. And the funny thing is, you can say, wow, these are really abstract metaphysical claims, but I think this is how a lot of the critics of postmodernism, a lot of the critics of my uber-modernist explanations, which I think are found very clearly in Nietzsche's work, but people often don't want to hear that Nietzsche is a postmodernist or uber-modernist. I think what Goethe is describing here is actually how a lot of them actually think. Like, okay, sure, you can say the tree is a trillion particles, but I see a tree, I experience a tree. Do you see a tree? Yeah, you see a tree. So it's just a tree, right? Functionally speaking, we don't have a problem identifying these phenomenal unities, we might call them, the unity of the phenomenon we encounter. So just go with it. Because if you go further, you plunge into a potential infinity of abstractions. It's a common kind of response to these types of arguments. And you could call it pragmatism, because oftentimes just people appeal to this, like, you have to do this to get things done. That's kind of the basis of Goethe's opinion as well, that we have to, in order to get things done, in order to quicken our activity, accept the phenomenon. Because, otherwise it's just navel-gazing and... to get into Heidegger again, really the perception that we have in the world is the object as it relates back to ourselves, what we use the object for, what it means to us. So there is something very practical and very, what might we say, facilitating of action if we just accept the object as it does exist for us, apparently in a unity. That's how it appears, right? But think about how strange that is. Because this is a position that's called realism. Not realism in terms of, again, being down to earth, but realism in terms of, like when we talk about moral realism or moral fictionalism, right? The moral realist is saying morals are real. Goethe is presenting a kind of metaphysical realism, the realism of the class or the category or the morphology based on this phenomenon idea. which is not based on any scientific evidence or any kind of facticity about the world. It's purely a metaphysical claim that would seem to ignore the facts on the ground. And yet, the people who will posture themselves as the rational defenders of, enlightenment reason and the modernist theory of truth, the correspondence theory of truth, will largely accept Goethe's way of thinking, which I think is interesting. And the other interesting thing is that this approach leads Goethe to produce a theory of colors that is frankly totally wrong. Goethe spent decades opposing Newton and Newton's color theory, and fundamentally the reason was because of his belief in the Urphänomen. Quote, "The Urphänomen underlying Goethe's theory of colors is the polarity between light and darkness. Light for him is the bright white radiance of a sunny day, not that ray distilled by Newton, forced through the tiniest holes and tortured by complicated mechanisms. That white light should be a concoction of various colors is to Goethe a, quote, manifest absurdity. It is not the colors which produce the white light, but the white light which produces the colors. Quote, colors are the actions and suffering of light, he says, the result of its meeting with darkness. Thus darkness is not merely defined as the absence of light, it is a creative force in its own right, end quote. So the fundamental phenomenon at play in color, as Goethe sees it, is a polarity between light and darkness. And part of why Goethe thinks this way is that in his own experiments, looking through a prism, he saw that colors emerged on that frontier between light and dark, and it seemed as though the colors were formed by the interaction. So this is not that important because, look, any of you who have any background in physics probably know the ways that Goethe is simply wrong about much of what he says. Obviously, Goethe could say modern physics is wrong because it's proceeding from this wrong-headed mechanistic view of truth. It's neither here nor there. We'll set that to the side. The point is that, as with his theories in botany, the reason why Goethe was so insistent that white light wasn't made up of colors, but rather produces them, is not because of an experiment he ran. It's because of that perception of the Urphänomen, of the polarity between light and darkness. And when he says light, he means light in the way that we ordinarily talk about light, not as a ray or as photon particles that you can't see. He means light, literally. And that therefore the phenomenon of light is a unity. It can't be this thing that breaks down into constituent parts of other colors. It must be the creative force that produces the colors. But the importance of all of this is not whether or not Goethe has anything to contribute to modern science. As Heler points out, his scientific work is not anti-mathematical, it's amathematical, which means it isn't even science. And when it comes to his attacks on Newton, he mostly just misunderstood what Newton was arguing anyway. Goethe's theory of colors is a fascinating artifact, but it's not particularly important, just as his theory about plants has. There's an interesting potential vindication in today's biological morphology, but nevertheless, that was something he arrived at more by intuition than by experiment, even if some experimenting and some hard science was admittedly involved. So what is the importance here? For Heler, it all goes back to that same debate between Goethe and Schiller. Is the Urpflanze merely an idea, or is it something quote-unquote real? Schiller says no, Goethe says yes. And in them we sort of have in that dispute, we sort of have another instance of Luther and Zwingli in this dispute over the symbol. And in Heller's opinion, by the way, Goethe's theory of colors is probably most fascinating, not because of the actual theory, but because it contains a whole history of the scientific method. And Heler argues, even though it's a history of the scientific method from Goethe's perspective, it may be one of the first attempts at writing such a history. And the conclusions that Goethe draws from this history are fascinating. Quote, what above all emerges most clearly is the fact that every scientific theory is merely the surfaced rationalization of a metaphysical substratum of beliefs, conscious or unconscious, about the nature of the world. And it is these beliefs, too, these models of reality constructed in human minds and souls, which live and prosper for vast stretches of history in perfect pragmatic integrity, and to a remarkable extent create, not find and accept, the shape of the external world. End quote. So even here we see that questioning of the notion that through science we establish objective truths. So don't let anyone tell you that postmodernism is new. There are little sparks of it all throughout philosophy. But Goethe neither uses this as a pretext to deny the truth, nor to reimagine a new universal definition of truth. Rather, as Heler puts it, he believes instead in, quote, the intuitive, indeed visionary faculty of his own genius, end quote. And perhaps there cannot be a more satisfying answer than that one for Goethe, despite how unsatisfying it is. But it elucidates something fascinating insofar as it brings out Goethe's opposition to Kant, which crops up throughout this essay. Goethe despised the fact that Kant had, quote, absolutely denied to human intelligence the possibility of seeing ideas, that the human understanding should be forever imprisoned within the confines of that unhappy hunting ground where the physical scientist is after his phenomenal game, end quote. And so what Goethe attempts to do, we could think about it this way. I mean, we have Kant's promise that it's possible to lift up the human being to a kind of moral life that approximates the moral law of the heavens by his own sovereignty, his own will, out of his own freedom. Then perhaps it's possible to lift up the human being's intellect to a kind of divine perception or genius. That's specifically what Kant said we couldn't do. And the way that Kant describes the rational possibility of a divine mind, though, that he describes it as a mind that is not discursive, but intuitive, and descends from the universal to the particular, from the one to the many. Goethe underlined that line of Kant's work and suggests that by contemplation of nature, perhaps we could rise to that same level of perception. We could go from the many to the one. And he ties this specifically to his quest to discover the Urphenomen, because in studying the Urphenomen, you are in that way proceeding by an all-encompassing intuition that proceeds from the many to the one, and from the one to the many, from the universal to the particular and back again. And at times, Goethe was very confident about all of this. He would, sometimes wrote that he thought he could occupy the role of a new Francis Bacon or something like that. And at other times, he lost heart in his scientific projects, and sometimes wrote of escaping from science into the realm of poetry, where one could experience, as he put it, real satisfaction. And there's a great significance in this, too, because we now get a sense for sort of like the total picture of Goethe's place in the dialectic. He makes the attempt to find that unity of the real and the significant within science. And he's a very odd character to attempt to do that within science, because he's not primarily a scientist. And perhaps it's precisely because of his poetic and intuitive mind that he makes the attempt. And also because of this, he's out of his depth. So he retreats back to poetry. He's always sort of on the back foot when trying to do science, and he was always destined to retreat back to poetry, where his work is frankly unparalleled. And it's there in poetry and in the contemplation of nature from the poetic mindset that he can actually find that sought-after unity. It can become real for him. The real, the meaningful, that actually can still come out in poetry. Goethe writes, quote, beauty is the manifestation of secret laws of nature, which, were it not for their being revealed through beauty, would have remained unknown forever, end quote. And that's a very interesting way of putting it, because beauty is the manifestation of nature's secret laws. That very much sounds like, the scientist, that's what Bacon says. The scientist tries to discover nature's secret laws. So that's the revelation of truth. But here Goethe speaks instead in the language of beauty. And Heller's note on this is that this sets the stage for Romanticism. The Romantics, as a whole, retreated from scientific thinking, from the scientific work. They found it unsatisfying the way Goethe did, and they plunged themselves into the poetic world. And Goethe, with his own classical intellect, he had his own criticism of the Romantics. He also finds Romanticism unsatisfying. But that's precisely because they have abandoned the real in pursuit of a worldview of pure poetry. So, which Goethe does not do. He thinks he can find the real in the world of pure poetry. So he's deeply unsatisfied with the scientific view of truth. He's positing his own view of truth based on his own genius. But the Romantics, they're just the other side of the coin. They have their own lack, their own inadequacy. To put it straightforwardly, they have a lack in addressing the question of being, in that they're solely concerned with beauty and not truth. And there's no solution, seemingly. I mean, Goethe lives in both of these worlds, but ultimately he can't unify them. We could argue as to whether he unified them within himself, but he can't square the circle, solve the problem in explicit philosophical language. He can't lay claim to having produced a philosophy that adequately salvages both scientific reason and poetic meaning. He has to try and live this contradiction, but he can't claim to have harmonized it. And so now, let's talk about the attempts that Goethe makes in poetry, because after all, this is about the hazard of modern poetry. And it's awesome that we get to talk about Goethe's scientific concern and his view of the scientific truth, because knowing that about Goethe, his whole orientation to the question of truth will inform what he's doing in poetry. And for the rest of the episode, we're going to look at his play Faust, his magnum opus, which we've talked about in an episode of the podcast before. I'll link it in the description. Which Faust is arguably an attempt to capture or give form to the condition of the modern man and the modern mind in Goethe's time. Faust centers around this character, Dr. Faustus, who wishes to penetrate beyond the veils, perceive the true reality behind the appearances. In Kaufman's translation, there's that wonderful set of lines, which I'll try to remember as closely to verbatim as possible, where Faust exclaims, "I want to see what secret force hides behind the world and determines its course." And so he exhausts all the faculties of the university in his quest for knowledge. He becomes a doctor or a master in all of the faculties. And after acquiring all that book learning available, he realizes he has not found the truth. He has no meaning, no fulfillment. He contemplates suicide. He hasn't found the truth in the Goethean sense of the word truth. He's found plenty of scientific truth in the strict scientific sense that we've been talking about. And it's after this attempt at suicide that the devil appears to him. He offers him a bet, a wager, that he can give Faust the whole panoply of human experience, but if Faust should ever experience the zenith of human happiness and wish for the moment to abide, if he should ever experience a moment that is satisfying, where he affirms life and he wishes for some high moment to go on forever, at that moment the devil will take his soul to hell. Now, in the traditional stories about Dr. Faust, which are probably based on folk tales and legends, in all of these retellings of the story, Faust has his soul taken to hell. It's not usually presented as a wager. It's simply a contract where he sells his soul to the devil, and the devil, of course, takes his soul. And in the adaptation of Christopher Marlowe, the English writer who produced the best version of Faust before Goethe's version, that is also the case. Faust is damned. And, in fact, in that version, Faust is even given the chance to repent of his sins, and he says, "No, I've made an agreement with Satan, and I'm going to honor my agreements." In Goethe's version, however, it's not a contract, it's a wager, and furthermore, the story is framed in the prologue as a wager between God and Satan, similar to the book of Job. And as with that book, God tells Satan, in this case, Mephistopheles is the name that the devil is going by these days. God tells him, "You're going to lose the bet, and Faust will be saved." And just as in the book of Job, I guess the devil is rather stubborn and doesn't know that you can't really win a bet against an omnipotent, omniscient deity. That's neither here nor there. The rationale that the angels give as they save Faust is that his ever-renewed spirit of striving is what allows them to save him. Whoever strive with all their might, we are allowed to save. So Faust is saved not by faith, not by repentance. He's saved by his works, by his deeds, by his spirit, by his activity. And he does lots of evil things. He ruins Gretchen's life. He destroys the home and kills Philemon and Baucis, this old couple who are standing in the way of progress, right? Faust becomes part of this, the project to reclaim land in the style of the Netherlands and to, be able to feed and house millions in the name of this progress that Faust has promised. Some people have to die. But, so he does all these evil things, but he turns his activities in a productive direction. And even though he does give in and he says, "Abide moment, thou art so fair," God intercedes and saves Faust, or the angels intercede. And, it's not a very revolutionary idea in Christianity to simply say that God's will always trumps Satan. And so you can construe the meaning of Faust to put it in very oversimplified terms as using that element of Christianity, that the power of God to save anyone, in order to redeem the active man, the creative man, the striving man, the man who pursues his dreams, his ambitions, his desires, as a valuable type, a type not to be condemned, but to be exalted in the heavens, even if he does plenty of evil or sinful things in the process, which is arguably a life-affirming reimagining, a re-evaluation of the character, because Goethe he's reevaluating living and doing things and having goals and dreams and desires more highly than simply, the ascetic ideal, which is typically held up in Christian stories as the path to goodness, piety and renunciation. So the old story was Faust was bad for wanting to go beyond the power and knowledge afforded to ordinary people. He should have known better and just been a good, humble Christian. The new story is God values people who want to go beyond their knowledge and the power of humanity as it is now. He'll forgive their sins in doing so long as they sincerely commit to their striving, to their ideal. So it totally flips the ascetic ideal on its head. Now, that's sort of the normal reading of Faust, but Heler's reading is a critical one. And he approaches this criticism of Goethe in all due respect. He says that all criticism of him has to be carefully navigated. But, on the other hand, there's so much emotion and sentimentality around Goethe, because among those who read him and love him, it can be very easy to simply be purely admiring and fail to think about his work and its significance from a critical lens, and therefore you could misconstrue its significance in some ways. And one of those ways, in Heler's view, is failing to see the central fault in Goethe. And that fault is the avoidance of tragedy. Heler situates this critical interpretation of Goethe by attempting to understand Goethe in the historical moment. And what he concludes about Goethe is that he was precisely the kind of person who had no understanding for the historical moment, that his struggles with rationalism and romanticism were not undertaken because he was conscious of a particular, a discontinuity between himself and the broader zeitgeist. At least he was not aimed at correcting any kind of discontinuity. Rather, Heler says that, quote, "the very nature of his genius deprived Goethe of that particular kind of historical sense," end quote. And he says that, quote, "in the spiritually barren climate of 18th and 19th century society, amidst that Vanity Fair of conflicting values and self-contradictory aspirations, a genius so apparently chaotic and yet so profoundly organized as that of Goethe will seem to itself and to others almost monstrous, demonic, extra-human. In fact, the spirit of nature itself," end quote. And so, on the one hand, even Heller's critical comments on Goethe are still kind of admiring. I mean, Goethe, he lives as like a kind of force of nature. That's how he experiences himself. He's creative and introspective. He's poetic and scientific. But above all, he's just driven. And he seems by turns rational and irrational, or passionate and sober, but he's not calculating about this. There's not some broader conscious meaning behind that. It's the direction he's driven in at a given time. And this is how everyone else experiences him too, right? And, one of the things Heler says later, there's no creed you can draw from Goethe's writings, and that you can find all these contradictions in his thought if you really try. And because of who he is, he doesn't really think of himself historically. Again, for Goethe, all truth refracts back onto the issue of what he can use, what can quicken his activity. And so genius and the meaning of genius in the broader historical context is not what Goethe thinks about. He thinks instead a great deal simply about the meaning and the puzzle of his own genius in particular. In reference to that line of Holderlin's, "In such spiritless times, why be a poet at all?" Heler says the following, quote, Goethe knew that question, and there were periods in his life when he actually did answer it in the negative, and all but behaved accordingly. But for him, the question was not an historical one, not why be a poet at all in spiritless times, but solely whether he himself was a poet. True, he wrote, and just when he was about to resume his work on Faust, quote, "We are compelled to step out of our century if we wish to work according to our convictions." This was in a letter to Schiller, November 25th, 1797. But such statements are extremely rare. Unaware of the deeper historical perspective of his situation, he merely perceived through his own agonies and through his spontaneous hostility towards almost all and everything that represented the spiritual character of his century, its rationalism, its romanticism, its unnatural hysterias, its cold empiricism, its idealistic philosophies, its tempestuous music, that there was a gulf fixed between what he himself was in his inmost being and the world in which he lived as a citizen. End quote. And so Heler's interpretation of Goethe's character is one in which Goethe's character mirrors his life philosophy. Goethe's genius is unified, it's a force of nature, while Goethe sees nature herself as unified. He puts forward this interpretation of nature based on his theories about the Urphänomen, which completely contradicts and flies in the face of the current scientific zeitgeist because of something he feels and that he says he sees with his very eyes. That's something within himself, a unity of nature that's directly perceptible. And Heler points out how Goethe used the term unnatural as the worst pejorative, that he said he never systematically studied Spinoza, but he said that whenever he read the works sporadically, he felt that he intuitively understood Spinoza. Goethe felt that Spinoza adequately described nature in a way that was not self-contradictory and that he could derive useful things from it. So there's sort of this tendency that Heler points out for Goethe to associate himself with nature, or to have a kind of self-assurance that his sensibilities represent nature itself. And he openly identified himself as a pantheist and as a student of nature. And so there's this association again of Goethe the man with nature, which we might say nature is eternal. Its individual forms are ever-changing, but its organization, its patterns are unchanging, its laws. Nature is sort of also unaware of the endless changes in the historical or political movement. Those are just coming and going forms, after all. And so, funnily enough, Schiller often tried in his correspondence with Goethe to get him to adopt a more introspective, and perhaps we might say philosophical approach in finishing the Faust play. He recognized the power of Goethe's spontaneous poetry, his quote-unquote natural style, as it was called, his totally uncontrived style. But he counseled Goethe that to really complete Faust, he would have to contrive some things. To conclude the story in a satisfying manner, you're going to have to go in with some intentionality, with some structure. You can't just write this as a spontaneous natural poem. I mean, maybe that was a powerful style in your youth, Goethe, when you wrote The Sorrows of Young Werther, but here you really need to introduce reason into your work. It can't all be based on how you feel or your intuition as a genius. You need to consciously manifest some philosophical point in order to bring the story to a satisfying end. And Heler writes that Schiller was always trying to intercede in this way, but, quote, "It was no good. Ideas were not embodied in the society of his time, and in the abstract terms of philosophical speculation, Goethe had no use for them. He had to see them to feel them. But when he did see and feel them, they became so real to him that he was even surprised that to others they appeared to be mere ideas." The impression that Goethe's genius is wholly nature is partly due to an optical illusion caused by the refraction in the medium of a spiritless time, where the spiritual had ceased to be incarnate, having evaporated into vague abstractions. The anemic and artificial civilization of his day drove Goethe again and again into a realm where the, quote, real thing could be found. This is why Italy was such a revelation for Goethe. There, set up against a clearer sky and the memory of a clearer realization of the human destiny, he found a vision of life in which nature and humanity were merged in a, quote, natural civilization. It would be inadequate to the point of idiocy to approach Goethe in a moralizing fashion, but there is no reason why one should not see that with such a predominance of nature within him and such a lack of civilized tradition around him, he had to fail when faced with the tragic or religious aspect of the moral problem as it is inherent in the very plots of both Iphigenia and Faust. No human being can come to grips with such a problem unaided by tradition and traditional teaching." End quote. And on that last line, obviously Nietzsche would disagree with Heller. I think I disagree with Heller to some extent. I think he's a bit too absolutist in that statement. But he's not really saying anything that Carl Jung didn't say, by the way, that the tradition and tradition's symbols and teachings contain invaluable messages for confronting evil, tragedy, the extremities of human experience, including the highest ecstasies, the worst sufferings, pride, guilt, moral recrimination. That Goethe, in so many words, was simply too individual, too confident in his own individual genius, which knew nothing of moralism and these old dichotomies of good and evil, or the sacred and profane, that in the face of his Spinoza's pantheism, everything in the world looks innocent. And that's also very similar to Nietzsche's outlook, by the way, or rather, Nietzsche's outlook was similar to Goethe's because he was influenced by him. And at the very least, even though I don't buy Heller's argument as an absolute, I would say that in terms of what speaks to the soul of most people, I think Nietzsche's approach, Goethe's approach, the Heraclitean mold of the intellectual, which is simply, founded on one's own perception and intuition and attempts to transcend all these traditional or orthodox categories of right and wrong, right? That's a very dissatisfying explanation of tragedy for many people. When a society is confronted with, say, atrocities, with great iniquities or suffering, self-recrimination and guilt, those events, which seem to take on cosmic significance almost, as part of the morality play of the world, it doesn't seem an adequate explanation for some Nietzschean elitist to come along and say, oh, that atrocity happened, it wasn't a hideous evil, it was just part of nature, part of the natural order of things, deal with it, right? That strikes us as spiritually unequipped to really confront the nature of that. Frankly, we need a moral significance to evil. And to Nietzsche's credit, he said the same thing in The Will to Power, that the spiritual and moral significance attached to evil and suffering was one of the things that Christianity provided for the European mind as a positive benefit. Now, how does this relate to Goethe's tragedy of Faust? The argument would be that you need that moral sense, that groundedness in the sense of good and evil, right and wrong, sacred and profane even, in order to write a really compelling tragedy. That is really the true language of tragedy, and that Goethe lacks this moral sense as Faust's author, and he tells an amoral tale, which would therefore seem to fail to really confront any of the tragic nature of what happens in the story. And so Faust was called a tragedy. Goethe said it was the tragedy of Dr. Faust. It's supposed to be a tragedy, but as plenty of writers have pointed out, among them Nietzsche himself, it's not a very tragic work. In the end, it's a comedy. Faust is saved. And Gretchen, the tragedy of the first part, right, is that Faust seduces a young woman, and because she's smitten with him, she makes a series of terrible mistakes, and her life is ruined, and ultimately she dies. And that's sad, but Nietzsche asks, is this really the height of the tragic idea among the Germans? Because for one, after her death, Faust is sort of magically rejuvenated from the grief he feels at the beginning of part 2 by spirits of nature. They come in and he forgets about all of that, and he moves on with his life. And in the end, not only is Faust saved, but so is Gretchen. He sees her in heaven. Oh, she's saved. It's fine, right? So the tragedy in part 1 is not just a dead end of calamity and murder and sorrow, as, for example, Greek tragedies usually are. It's not a confrontation, therefore, with the utmost ugliness and depravity of life. It's instead a tragedy that is redeemed and undone. Everything works out in the end. And so Heler raises the question of Goethe's avoidance of tragedy, whether the man was really capable of writing a true tragedy. And Heller's not the first one to notice this. In implicit terms, the philosopher Karl Jaspers also noticed this. He wrote of the period in Germany immediately after the Second World War. And he said, quote, "We came face to face with experiences in which we had no inclination to read Goethe, but took up Shakespeare or the Bible or Aeschylus, if it was possible to read at all," end quote. And Heller's comment on this is, quote, "What was the nature of the experience in the face of which Goethe offered no help? It was the very kind of experience before which Goethe himself always proved helpless, the exposure to the manifestations of evil and sin. The mere attempt to write tragedy might be my undoing, he once said, and it was the truth, at least for the greatest part of his life. Among his dramas, there are 3 dramatic poems which, more than any other dramas he wrote, established his fame: Iphigenia, Tasso, and Faust. All of them are potential tragedies, indeed so much so that one may feel that the tragic conclusion could only be avoided at the price of complete artistic conclusiveness. They show a moving and yet unsatisfactory reluctance of mind and imagination to accept the rule of the road leading to the very center of human destiny." End quote. So he mentions Iphigenia again. He also mentions another work, Tasso. We've discussed these works directly or indirectly to greater or lesser degrees in the show, and there's material in this book about these works, but I didn't want to I didn't want to bring too many things into this episode because there's already a lot here. So I'll just give a brief synopsis here that Iphigenia is Goethe's version of the tragedy by Aeschylus, Iphigenia at Aulis. Other playwrights in ancient Greece dramatized the story, as did other writers in the Renaissance. And if you remember from when we covered the Oresteia by Aeschylus, the events of Iphigenia occur prior to the first play of the Oresteia, the Agamemnon. And those events are largely the cause of the events in the Oresteia. In that play, Agamemnon receives portents that in order for his fleet to sail for war against Troy, he has to sacrifice his daughter, Iphigenia. Later, as revenge for doing that, his wife and Iphigenia's mother, Clytemnestra, assassinates Agamemnon. Iphigenia is Goethe's version of that play. The Tasso is Goethe's play about the playwright Torquato Tasso. We haven't actually discussed that work, except in passing. We've talked about Tasso's work Orlando Furioso. Veltgeist and I briefly talked about that work in a patron exclusive. We were discussing the history of these chivalric epics in Europe in relation to the Grail legend, these epic poems about crusading knights. And also Nietzsche references an element of Tasso's work when he brings up the Garden of Armida as a metaphor in one of his passages. And we talked about that one way back in episode 2 of the podcast or something. And so Goethe's tragic play that bears Tasso's name is about the playwright's descent into madness. So if we just consider the material in each of these works, they all point towards tragedy. But as Goethe says, his attempts to write tragedy might be his undoing. It's just simply not in his nature, and in Heler's view, he pretty much fails on all accounts. Again, we don't really have time to talk about Iphigenia or Tasso. We are going to talk about Faust with the time that we have left, and I want to focus on Faust because that is the work we did a 2-part episode on. It's also Goethe's best work. I assume many of you will be familiar with it, and it's the one that I know the best. And Heller's argument is made perfectly well solely by looking at Faust as the example. So Heler argues that in Faust, Mephistopheles, the devil, does not give Faust really anything he does not already have. In terms of an incitement to action or in terms of a motivation, Mephisto hardly even does any magic in the play. And whenever he does, it's a relatively minor spell. And one wonders why Faust couldn't have simply done some of these things himself. I mean, in the universe of the play, he's an accomplished magician. Or one of the things that the devil does is, Faust needs to have his life extended so that he can be young again. And the devil doesn't, just do this with magic. He has him go visit a witch, an apothecary, who gives him a potion to drink. And, makes you wonder, why couldn't Faust have tracked down this witch himself? So Heler writes, quote, "All Mephistopheles can do is give Faust a hand, in a job of which he already knows the essential tricks of the trade. All this would be rather irrelevant if it were not at the center of the essential ambiguity of Faust, the most striking outcome of Goethe's avoidance of tragedy. What does Faust really expect of Mephistopheles? Still more magic? No, but contentment, rest, peace, to be able to say to the moment, 'Stay, thou art so fair.' In other words, life is good," end quote. But Heler points out how strange that is, that Faust would seek such a thing as peace and contentment from the devil. The same devil whom he recognizes as the one who causes him to tumble from desire to fulfillment. Quote, "And in fulfillment I crave for more desire," end quote. Mephisto is also a spirit of desire and negation. He is the doubting intellect, the critical intellect that's never satisfied in its doubting and criticism. and thus he's an agitating force. He's a force that always provokes dissatisfaction with the present moment. And furthermore, God in the prologue, quote, challenges Mephistopheles to alienate Faust from the springs of life, to uproot him. If he succeeds, Faust will be his. This sounds more like deprive him of all peace, if indeed you can, rather than make him contented with the moment, end quote. And obviously what Heler is citing there is the book of Job, the bet that Satan can basically torment Job enough that he will curse God, right? And that's what God says, deprive him of all peace if indeed you can. Whereas Mephisto's bet with God in Faust is actually, sure, give him all the pleasures of the world, fulfill all his desires, and so fulfill him so much that he becomes contented with the moment. So we're starting to bring out the essential ambiguity that Heler sees here, that Faust has this spirit of striving, this spirit of desire, and Mephisto also represents this spirit. It isn't clear that anything he actually does changes what Faust would have done anyway. It isn't clear that Faust is actually having a confrontation with evil or with the temptation towards evil, because Goethe has such this innocent view of the world, and in many ways Faust is his proxy, it's his stand-in, and Goethe didn't experience the confrontation with evil in his own life. He just didn't look at things that way. So it isn't a confrontation with Satan in the Christian sense that spurs Faust onto righteousness or repentance. And the play isn't a downfall into sinful ambition that serves as a warning for others, a morality play in the style of Marlowe. No, God tells us from the beginning that Faust will be saved. He sets the devil on a course in his quest to tempt Faust that will not actually lead Faust to lose the bet, because the devil is the same spirit of striving that keeps Faust from ever wanting the moment to abide, ever resting in self-complacency. And ultimately, Heler leans into the interpretation that Faust perhaps doesn't even actually wish for the moment to abide. This is one of the sort of competing interpretations of the ending of Faust. It's one that I don't buy into, but here's what Heler has to say, that, when Faust says the words, he's thinking of a rapidly approaching future state of self-complacency that he will soon reach. And he says, in that moment, I might say, abide moment, thou art so fair. The reason why I take the other view is that Faust doesn't just say the words, he's like imagining that soon he will be content, which one could say is itself a form of contentment. Because you might argue, we never find ourselves content in the actual state of rest. We achieve happiness or fulfillment when we're in the act of fulfilling a goal, and it's as they're working to complete these great projects of building that Faust has orchestrated that he says, very soon I will be ready for the moment to abide. Right? So he can finally imagine coming to rest because he is fulfilled and happy. That's my interpretation. It isn't really important, however, whether the devil tries to take him on a technicality, whether Faust legitimately calls out for the moment to abide. The point is that Faust was always going to be saved because Goethe was never going to let Faust be damned. That, true to the structure of the play, the god of the story, Goethe himself, doesn't require anything of Faust himself to save him. And Heler writes the following, which I think is very insightful, quote, what is Faust's sin? Restlessness of spirit. What is Faust's salvation? Restlessness of spirit. The confusion lies in a perpetual crisscrossing of restless strivings of different qualities. The striving for peace, the striving for sensation, or to put it differently and in terms of the quality of the contentment sought, the striving for that peace that passeth all understanding, and the striving for a state of calm, and enough, which is merely a state of emotional exhaustion. What the heavenly powers mean by that striving, which carries its own salvation, must surely be different from the striving, the goal of which Faust hopes to achieve with the help of black magic and the devil. End quote. This is, in a nutshell, the essential ambiguity, that Faust's damnation and salvation are the exact same thing. There's nothing that Faust has to do or change or overcome. There's sort of this strange confluence or crisscrossing of restless strivings of different types, but where does Goethe weigh in to say which one is better than the other or make any kind of sense out of that? right? Again, just return to that idea that Goethe is a force of nature himself, and a lot of this will make a lot of sense. And so there's no way in which Faust is punished for the way that he is, or punished for not changing or transforming. And personally, I think that's a bit overwrought in Heler's analysis. Again, it might be a little bit too far. I think you can argue that Faust does learn, he does grow and develop as a character, but I think it's very subtle, and it's certainly within the purview of that Goethean amorality, we might call it. It's precisely that amoral nature of Goethe's Faust that prevents it from becoming a spiritually nourishing tragedy of the same class that Shakespeare wrote or Aeschylus wrote. And I should note, Erich Heller is practically worshipful of Goethe's genius, and he considers his works, Faust atop all of them, as masterworks. And the poetry and the style of Faust is almost unparalleled. The story, for whatever tragic ambiguity there is this like account of a voyage of the human soul across ages and places and dimensions and states of mind. But we cannot fail to at least tangle with the critique made by Heller and by Nietzsche that it doesn't really attain the heights of tragedy. Quote, "Nature is fundamentally innocent, and Goethe's genius is in communion with nature. Hence there can be for Goethe no catharsis, only metamorphosis. It is never with the spirit of transcendent God or with the spirit of man that Goethe's potentially tragic heroes are reunited after their dramatic crises. When the crisis is over, they are at one again with the spirit of nature. They are not purified in the tragic sense, not raised above their guilt through atonement, but enter, as it were, a biologically, not morally, new phase of life, healed by oblivion and restored to strength through the sleep of the just. This is what happens to Orestes and what happens to Faust at the beginning of part 2." End quote. And so, there is something I should say from the perspective of a Nietzschean, that Nietzsche would agree with what Heller is saying about the nature of Faust as a tragedy. That is to say, it isn't very tragic. But he would probably disagree with many of the general comments about tragedy. Tragedy is, as Nietzsche described it, tragedy is a kind of neurosis of the healthy, in which those with an excess of life throw themselves into pain and suffering and ugliness and make it beautiful, and that no moral significance is therefore needed. Tragedy for Nietzsche is totally aesthetic, just as it is for Goethe. He only criticized Goethe for not being tragic enough, whereas Heller's criticism is basically that moral elements are needed for tragedy to be meaningful. You need sin and guilt and repentance. You need some kind of moral transformation that's not merely biological. But Goethe's obsession with nature and the biological metamorphosis that the characters undergo, perhaps that prefigures something more like Nietzsche's Overman, but one really gets the sense that Heller thinks that true tragedy is essentially religious and moral, and it's related to the spirit as understood in a traditional sense of the term spirit. So, Goethe, this force of nature, this man who feels nature to be within himself and therefore has this profound sense of the innocence of himself and the world and therefore of his characters, and that makes him unable to really commune with the tragic. What are we to take from all this? Let's go back to where we started the episode, Marburg, 1529, the moment where the symbolism of the Eucharist in the medieval sense is denied, and it becomes instead a mere symbol. Spirit is no longer incarnated into the world, because so long as Jesus' body exists and is a part of his followers, the Spirit is made flesh on earth. But with this revolution in thought, over time that embodied spirit begins to disappear. The phrase God is with us seems to be little more than a metaphor. And those struggles between good and evil, between God and the devil, begin to seem quaint, like superstitions. And so by the time of Goethe, even good and evil itself has disappeared into the pandemonium of innocent nature, and therefore Heller says this inner tension is not between guilt and redemption, but between titanic ambitions and despair, between moments of activity and moments of resignation, moments of yearning for these sensations and moments of exhaustion, wishing for rest. This is what Faust experiences, because that's what Goethe experienced. And while that may really resonate with other artists or with a select group of people, it's not going to be an adequate salve for the soul for most in the face of real suffering, because quite frankly, Goethe didn't suffer from the kinds of things that make ordinary people suffer. And so, with Goethe, we have great works, but no tragedies, only potential tragedies. Because true tragedy, or divine comedy, Heler asserts, is already almost impossible during Goethe's time. You would need a genius who was attuned to the spirit of the age to really produce one, and Goethe is mismatched in that respect. And in spite of Goethe's genius, nothing is solved by him. Heler writes, quote, "It was impossible for Goethe to accept the situation, and impossible by the very nature of things to solve it," end quote. And what he's getting at here is the problem of that separation again, of that autonomous rationality from irrational meaning, which is contained in art and religion, to some extent philosophy, insofar as philosophy is understood as ontology, about the question of being, that just as Goethe was not in a position to impose ontology onto science through his amathematical scientific theorizing based on his intuitions, neither was he really in a position to offer us a portrait of mankind that fits the universal or common experience, because after all, it is a work of poetry, and we're no longer in the age in which poems offer universal truths or guides to life. Poems don't contain truth anymore, remember? No one thinks that. That's a pre-rational understanding of poetry. Goethe ultimately then does the only thing he really can do. He just gives us a self-portrait in his Faust, rather than a portrait of mankind, rather than a universal truth. And this speaks to the hazard of modern poetry just as much as, it speaks to that division of these two spheres of human life and experience, just as much as the impoverishment of the sciences through their lack of ontology, the lack of any ability to give meaning. This is the inverse of that, right? Because everything else in Goethe's intellect is simply a refraction. It refers back to him. All truth had to be verified according to the principle that it facilitated the genius of Goethe. And so, just as science cannot produce meaning, right? He gives us very meaningful works in, the form of Faust and Iphigenia and Tasso, but works which are not, in some sense, true. They're untrue because ununiversal, because they are solely concerned with those things of beauty, intuition, sensation, all of these things that never have to refer back to the real. And when the real world and the suffering in it kind of butts up against you, when you have a confrontation with it, like Karl Jasper says, that's why Goethe is sort of insufficient. Now, in the broadest terms, this chapters on Goethe, it shouldn't be taken as a polemic against the man. This is just another symbolic excursion. Just as with Luther and Zwingli, Goethe is to become another image of life at a certain point in the zeitgeist, grappling with this fundamental issue of the depreciation of life's value, as Heler put it. And beyond that, Goethe's life and works are a concrete example of what Heler calls the hazard of modern poetry. Through this examination of him, we learn something of the moment in history, unhistorical as he is, and the challenge that confronted him as an artist in these spiritless times. And hopefully, from this, we can learn something of ourselves and our particular moment in the history of thought. That's all for this week, everyone. Next week, join me for the finale, Heller's commentary on Nietzsche, and how to think about Nietzsche as regards these questions about the hazards of modern poetry. Cheers, everybody. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.